Ok. I'll start em português, ok? Bem-vindos, este é mais um seminário NIED-CERES. Hoje nós temos o grande prazer de receber a professora Kim Weeden, da Cornell University, que é um grande nome da estratificação social. Nós vamos fazer o nosso seminário hoje em inglês, então eu vou mudar agora para o inglês e eu espero que vocês, enfim, aproveitem ao máximo. As pessoas que estão assistindo no YouTube podem fazer questões e mandar para a gente em português, nós traduzimos e mandamos para a professora Kim Weeden, e as pessoas que estão aqui conosco na sala de Zoom mesmo. Então, now switching to English, I'm glad to have here with us today Professor Kim Weeden, a major name in social stratification and sociology in the world. Everyone is proud of her work, and now we can talk to her and share a little bit of our ideas and mainly her about her new work. Professor Kim Weeden is a Jen Rock Zubro professor and Stephen Weiss Presidential Fellow of the Social Sciences at Cornell University and Director of the Center of Study of Inequality. She has also co-founded the open access journal Sociological Science and served as deputy editor at it for 8 years. She has earned her BA in sociology and psychology at the Willamette University and followed an MA and PhD at sociology from the University of Stanford under the supervision of David Gruss. She began her academic career at the University of Chicago before joining Cornell in 2001. During her career, Weeden has investigated the changing architecture of inequality in advanced industrial societies, examining occupational closure, income stratification, gender pay disparities, and gender segregation in the labor market. Professor Weeden has a very important paper published in 2002, Why Do Some Occupations Pay More Than Others, in which she has demonstrated how occupational closure generates wage inequality in differentials, and this work has earned the ASA Richard Scott Award. This is a very important work, a major contribution to the debate on micro and macro classes. Recently, Weeden, in collaboration with a former student, Zhang, has published a very important paper on how sex segregation in the United States undergraduate fields shapes the sex segregation in the labor force. And today, she's going to present a new work called Is the Gender Revolution Really Stalled? We anticipate her evidence-rich and theoretically rigorous perspective and are willing to hear from her. Now, Professor Weeden, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Share screen here. Does this look okay?
Yeah, I don't know if it's on purpose, but the colors are like mixed.
It is actually on purpose, believe it or not. But this should look a little bit, oops, more normal. Does that look more normal?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Good, thanks. It's been a while actually since I've given a talk on Zoom, and I have to say that usually when I do this, I'm at home, which means that there's a cat tail that kind of circulates across my screen. So I'm sorry that I'm actually at the office, so you won't get the cat screen today, the cat's tail. I should also say that I tend to speak very quickly, according to my mother, who has listened in on one of my talks, and her only comment was that I speak too fast. So if I turn out to do that, I hope that somebody will interrupt me and ask me to slow down a little bit. But what I want to talk about today is some new work in progress that I'm doing with a former graduate student, Daphne Gelgieser, who is at Tel Aviv University in Israel at the moment. And this is work that really tries to interrogate and make a little progress on this idea about social change and gender inequality. In a lot of the literature on gender inequality, particularly the empirical literature that has to do with the United States, we've settled on this narrative that the gender revolution, the progress toward gender equality, is somehow either completely stalled or it's slowed. And we see this in a very, very famous paper by Paula England and some co-authors that came out in 2020 in PNAS. The title there is on the screen: Progress Toward Gender Equality in the United States Has Slowed or Stalled. There was also about 15 or 12 years ago a paper or a op-ed that made it into the New York Times, Why is Gender Equality Stalled, by Stephanie Kuntz. And we see a lot of papers, not only just in the US literature, but more broadly about this idea that gender equality progressed very, very rapidly in the 1970s up through about the year 2000, but then something happened and it slowed or stalled. People have investigated this with a lot of different outcomes, looking at the household division of labor, so who is doing which types of housework and how many hours a week they're spending on it. People have investigated this with respect to labor force participation and this idea of opting out of some highly educated women, looking at work time, the number of hours per week that men and women are working, that seems to have stalled as well. Educational segregation, some of the topic of one of the papers that was mentioned earlier with my graduate student, Helen Zhang, looking at educational segregation. Basically, the distribution of men and women across college majors seems to have stalled out a little bit in terms of progress toward integration. People think about the gender wage gap and how that's kind of stalled, and we're no longer making much progress in the gender wage gap. And finally, in occupational segregation, which is really going to be the topic of today's talk. Occupational segregation, of course, refers to basically the distribution of men and women across different occupations within the labor market. And the idea that this distribution is somehow uneven, men and women are simply working in very, very different types of occupations, which has implications for other outcomes such as wages and earnings. I just want to, again, interrogate this idea of a stalled revolution and think, well, what are we really talking about when we talk about a stalled revolution? What are some of the assumptions that go behind this framing of inequality in gender as being a stalled revolution? And first of all, the first point here is that this framing assumes a particular form of change over time, a particular form of temporal variability. Namely, it's focusing on period change. So changes across periods. We talk about the 70s, the 80s, the 1990s. These are all talking about calendar time, and the image is one of a period change. And similarly, whenever scholars, and I would include myself in this and some of my other work, try to analyze changes in, say, occupational segregation over time, we really do so with analyses that privilege this idea, this clock of period or calendar time, as opposed to some of the other forms of temporal variability that we might think about. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of what this typical occupational sex segregation research looks like, I'm going to just walk you through one example here. This is coming from the same data that I'm going to be using throughout today's talk, but this type of analysis is really very, very common in the segregation literature. But the first step is that you choose some sort of an indicator of segregation. The most common choice here is D, or the index of dissimilarity. In case you don't remember what D is, I've given it there, a little refresher on the right-hand side of the and you can just think about it as a measure of unevenness that ranges from 0 to 1. And the higher the number, the more unevenly men and women are distributed across occupations within the labor market. There's a more formal definition there on the right-hand side, which is really the proportion of men, or you can think about it as the proportion of women, who would need to move to a female-dominated occupation in order for all the occupations in the labor market to have the same gender ratio as all other occupations. So the first step here is that you choose an indicator of segregation, and then you typically find some sort of a repeated cross-sectional survey, such as a census, where you have different periods represented. And then you calculate the index for each year in this repeated cross-sectional time series. And I've done this in the graphic here in the center of the screen. I've simply calculated this index of dissimilarity for each of these periods that are in the data. Even though the periods are given in 10-year chunks, I actually have annual data, one from each year. And then what you do after you've calculated the index is you kind of verbally characterize periods of change. So you might say, well, we have the rapid period there between 1970 and roughly 1995, a stalled period, and then maybe a slow period. Right? But this is the basic strategy for all of this trends in segregation research. It's really a period-based analysis. The challenge here, of course, is that there are these other clocks that we might think about when we're thinking about social change in occupational segregation. We might think about change over the life course. So this on the left-hand side of my screen is exactly the same data, but now instead of calculating the index of dissimilarity for each period, I've calculated it for each age group, right? So in here, you don't see a decline at all. You see actually an increase in occupational segregation indicated by D up until about age 60, and then a slight decline afterward. You could also think about the cohort clock. And here I've done this on the right-hand side of the screen. I've just calculated for every birth cohort in the data, now ranging from 1902 to 2020 is actually the most recent cohort in the data. I've just calculated D again, and it's a very, very different picture of change that you get. We might ask, well, first of all, was there a revolution at all if it's pretty steady decline since the 1920 cohort until the current cohort? And we might also ask, well, is there any evidence that the revolution has stalled when you're thinking about the cohort clock? So that's kind of the first problem here, is that the way that we tend to analyze change in gender inequality, and particularly change in occupational segregation, really privileges period and kind of ignores these other two clocks that we might think about, age and cohort. The second problem, and related to the first, is that very often our theories of change in gender inequality really talk about cohort succession and change over the life cycle as much as they talk about periods. So even if you think about a theory of change that's focused on, say, the impact of the feminist revolution in the 1970s, most sociologists don't think that that immediately changed everything about the labor market. Instead, we think, well, it probably changed how the most recent cohorts of young men and young women saw the opportunity structure and altered their educational decisions and their goals and their aspirations. And eventually that plays out, some 5, 10, 15, 20 years later in a cohort change, that cohort just had a very, very more egalitarian view of the labor market than the earlier cohorts. So the point here is that most of our theories of change are really as much about cohort succession as they are about periods. Similarly, we have lots of theories of change about what happens over the life cycle, particularly when people enter their childbearing and child-rearing years and how that affects gender inequality in the labor market. Sometimes this is even recognized. So this is a quote from the economist Claudia Golden, quite old quote at this point, but she was simply describing what she was talking about as a quiet revolution, actually, in the gender gap in wages, and just recognizing in this quote that some of the change really occurs by cohorts and some by period. And then the analyses that she was giving, which was a period-based analysis, was really should only be understood with respect to women at a particular age in the 30s in those periods that she was analyzing. So again, this tricky conflation of age, period, and cohort clocks that's going on. We could also think about a second form of theory analysis mismatch, and that is a lot of our theories of change in gender inequality and occupational segregation in particular are really thinking about gender-specific mechanisms, what's going on with women, what's going on with women's educational gains relative to men's, what's going on with gender differences in the amount of time that's available for paid work, assuming that there's this gender gap in unpaid work and so forth. So our theories of change are often talking about gender-specific mechanisms, but the indices of segregation that we use to map and to describe social change and segregation, they aggregate over men and women. And I hope that's going to become very, very clear as I march through the rest of the paper. So this is a very intimidating table, and I don't expect you to read all of the bullet points in the table. I'm not going to read all the bullet points in the table. But what I've tried to do here is to simply think a little bit about, well, what are some of the narratives that are in the gender inequality literature, and what are they really saying about cohort change and about life cycle change? And you might think about how they're thinking about period change as well. And what I've done is simply divide up into 3 sets of theories, some that talk about integrative change. So these are changes that we would anticipate would, for example, lead to cohort integration across cohorts as they're moving through calendar time. You might think that, well, increasingly egalitarian cohorts, for example, would eventually replace the more traditional cohorts and cause social change in segregation just by this process of cohort succession, of increasingly egalitarian worldviews among the young people in those cohorts. Right, that would be an integrative cohort change. We can also think about cohort change that is perhaps more segregative. It's leading toward more segregation in the labor market as opposed to less. And then finally, the right-hand column, we can think about cohort attributes. It's not really change, but cohort attributes that tend to be very stable over time, leading to this situation of either no trend or trendless fluctuation or a stalled revolution. Right? Again, the point here is not to illustrate every single possible theory that's out there. This is probably just a small fraction of the theories that are out there, but to illustrate the point that our theories of change are really much more complex and rich than simply looking at period analyses in a cross-sectional data set. I should also say I've given you this hugely complicated table with lots and lots of different possible mechanisms in it. I'm going to test exactly none of those. So again, I'm setting expectations low. I'm going to test exactly none of those hypothesized sources of change or stagnation. This isn't a talk about testing mechanisms. Instead, what I want to do today is to provide a new empirical analytic framework for describing social change in occupational sex segregation that, in my view, provides a better way of matching the way that we analyze sex segregation with our theories of sex segregation, and also provides a richer description of social change in occupational segregation than a lot of the previous work. And again, I'd be including some of my own work in this criticism of a relatively unnuanced way of thinking about social change in the literature so far. Then I'm going to illustrate this with US data. I'm sorry for focusing on the US. I know American scholars have a well-deserved bad reputation of always focusing on the United States, but I'm going to do it anyway. That said, I'm always looking for co-authors who want to take this approach and try and apply it to their own data sets in their own countries. So what is the analytic strategy? I'm going to give you kind of an overview of this analytic strategy before I apply it to the US data. And it's really drawing on kind of this very prominent and long-standing literature, goes back to the 1960s in the American literature, and especially in the early 1970s. A lot of people were talking about what became known as the APC identification problem. APC, I'm sorry, stands for age, period, and cohort. The problem, for those of you who are familiar with the literature, this is going to kind of be old news, but the problem is that period is a linear function of cohort and age, right? If you know somebody's cohort and you know their age at the time the data were collected, you also know the calendar year that the data were collected. You can also think about this in terms of cohorts. If you know the date of the data collection and you know the person's age at data collection and you subtract those, then you'll get the cohort. The problem is that you're trying to get 3 pieces of information, 3 effects, if you will, age, period, and cohort, out of what are really 2 pieces of information, or this idea of trying to squeeze blood from a stone. So there's a lot of literature, a lot of ink has been spilled about this APC problem. It turns out that there really isn't a good solution to it yet. Every once in a while, there are waves of papers that come out that say, hey, we've solved the APC identification problem. This is great. And then somebody else comes along a little while later and says, well, actually, the assumptions that you need in order to identify separate APC effects are really too strong, and they're probably not feasible or realistic assumptions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to avoid that Lego minefield. I have a young or formerly young son, and when he was very young and playing with Legos and you would leave them on the floor and you'd step on them in the middle of the night in bare feet, it hurt. I think kind of the APC literature as being a Lego minefield. I'm going to avoid a lot of those strong assumptions that you need to be able to identify separate APC effects. And instead, what I'm going to do is offer a very, very descriptive way of thinking about this that parses out cohort change. So this is looking at variability between cohorts as those cohorts are moving through calendar time. You can think about this as really this process of cohort succession over time. It's also going to parse out life cycle change. So thinking about intra-cohort variability, so within a cohort, as people are aging through calendar time. And it's also going to combine those two ideas by looking at what Ryder in 1965 called comparative cohort careers. And these are cohort-specific age-time trajectories. I know that's a mouthful. I'm going to return to that in another slide here. If there's time in my presentation, I'll give you a little bit of a bounding analysis that basically takes these very descriptive estimates and tries to say, okay, under particular assumptions about them, can we separate out age, period, and cohort effects? And what would that look like in terms of our estimates of temporal variability and occupational segregation? So this is the intimidating slide here. This is looking at the model that I'm using to estimate both cohort change, what I've called here is diachronic cohort slope. That basically means cohorts as they're moving through time. Dia and chronos means through time. And then similarly, the diachronic age slope. This model is not mine. It's not something that I developed. This comes from work by Ethan Fossey, who is a sociologist who did his PhD at Harvard under Chris Winship, one of his longtime co-authors. Ethan is now at the University of Toronto. But they came up with this model they called the diachronic LAPC model. And essentially what it's doing is it's allowing it's not trying to separate out individual APC effects. It's basically allowing cohort and time to be captured in one parameter and age and time to be captured in another parameter. And just to give you a sense, I'm not going to march through all of the individual letters and so forth. Just to give you a sense, though, of what's going on is it's fitting an age slope, basically looking at life cycle effects as people age through calendar time, but within the same cohort. It's looking at cohort effects. This is this idea of inter-cohort variability after you've netted out, in some sense, the effect of age. These parameters with the squiggly marks are age, period, and cohort nonlinearities. Fossey and Winship showed that you can, if you specify those nonlinearities properly with these orthogonal polynomials, you can actually fit independent age, period, cohort nonlinearities, basically take the bumps out of the data, essentially, and analyze those bumps separately, as opposed to just looking at the cohort slope, the linear slope, and the age slope. And then if you take all these three components together, these three estimands together, you get this idea of cohort-specific age-time trajectories, or what Ryder called these comparative cohort careers. So the second building block here is building on a very, very different literature. This is Mark Fawcett, and notice it's Fawcett as opposed to Fossey. It's a little bit confusing. But Mark Fawcett was a demographer who was very interested in residential segregation, not occupational segregation, but residential segregation. And he developed what he called a difference in means approach to estimating segregation indices. And what happens in his approach, it's actually quite clever, is that he recasts segregation as something that belongs to individuals. So individuals have a function of the type of occupation that they're in, whether it's a male-dominated or female-dominated occupation. The function that you specify for an individual differs depending on which index of dissimilarity or index you're trying to calculate. But the basic idea is that you can actually estimate the mean of men's probability in being in a male-dominated occupation, and the group mean for women and their probability of being in a male-dominated occupation. And that difference, the difference in means, is equivalent to D, or the index of dissimilarity, calculated in that kind of older way that I showed you earlier in the talk. So the important point here is that when we go back to this fancy pants diachronic LAPC model, I didn't talk at all about the Y variable, the left-hand side variable there, but this is essentially coming from the Mark Fawcett difference in means approach. And the outcome variable, the Y variable here, is simply a 0-1 flag. Is the respondent in a male-dominated occupation, or is the respondent not in a male-dominated occupation? And a male-dominated occupation here is defined as an occupation that has a higher share of men in it, or a higher share of the workers are men, than in the labor force as a whole. Right? So it's a simple 0-1 flag indicating whether the person's occupation is male-dominated or not, where male-dominated means more men in it than in the labor force as a whole, or greater share, rather. What's really neat about this is that it does allow you to estimate what's going on for men and women separately, but also to combine that through the simple differencing to actually see how men's change and women's change is related to the index of dissimilarity. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a future slide. So that's the basic analytic approach of the models that I'm going to be showing you. From here on out, it's all just going to be pictures. Pretty pictures, I hope. I'm going to be applying this to, again, data from the United States. The sample here is huge. It's 1.1 million men, nearly 1 million women. The period coverage that I have is data collected in 1970 up through data collected in 2023, so 33 years more or less worth of data. It's just the civilian labor force. It does include self-employed workers, so it's not just wage and salary workers. I'm going to apply the usual CPS weights. This is the weights provided by the U.S. Census Bureau. I'm going to be looking at the distribution of men and women across 376 detailed occupations that I've harmonized with some backcoding weights. I developed this procedure a long time ago, actually, when I was still in graduate school, and I've used it throughout. There are a few citations there if you're interested in what I'm actually doing there. The point is that I have a harmonized occupation scheme, so I can actually look across these many years of data at the same occupations and the distribution of men and women across those same occupations. I have 5-year age groups, 5-year periods, and 5-year birth cohorts. You can see that at the bottom left-hand box. And then in this LAPC model, what I'm going to be doing is fitting that model separately for men's data and for women's data, so that I can, again, analyze social change for men and women separately. And then I'm going to show you how that combines into the measure of the index of dissimilarity, or D. If there's time, again, I'm going to present some analyses by education level and also by parental status, because again, simply thinking very descriptively, these are major ways that we might think, well, the trends for men and the trends for women are very much different across, say, parental status or education level. Okay, so let's get to some results. So this is looking at the diachronic cohort curves. Again, you can just think about this as change across cohorts as those cohorts are moving through calendar time, or you can think about it as the amount of segregation that's changing, or the change in segregation through cohort succession. And what I have here, the purple is always going to be men, and the orange is always going to be women. And the y-axis here is the probability of being in a male-dominated occupation. Remember, again, male-dominated occupation means a greater share of men in that occupation than there are men in the labor force as a whole. And what you can see here is that for men, there's a decline in the probability of being in one of those male-dominated occupations across cohorts. I think I can do my little pointer here. From the earliest cohort, 1902, to the most recent cohort, it says 2000, it's actually 2002 is the most recent cohort, because they had to be 18 or older in order to be in the data. But what you can see here is a fairly monotonic decline in men's probability of being in a male-dominated occupation, with the exception of this little bump here for the birth cohorts in the late 1950s and early 1960s. You can also see for women an increase in the probability of being in a male-dominated occupation across these birth cohorts, again with a little bump here for the late 1950s, early 1960s cohorts. It turns out that the slope for men is about half as steep as the slope for women. So you can say that, well, all of this work that's focused on women's changes is correct in a sense, right? That most of the change is happening for women, but there's also still, I think, more change happening for men than we might anticipate. And certainly these results don't kind of justify simply looking at women when you're thinking about changes in occupational segregation. So again, steeper slope for women, but still non-trivial decline for men across birth cohorts in their probability of being in a male-dominated occupation. So I promised you that I would show you how this works out in D, and I thought it would be easiest just to do this with an illustration. This is exactly the same graph that was in the prior slide. And what I want to show you here is if we look at 1940 and we look at the difference, if we were to take the difference in 1940 between women's mean probability of being in a male-dominated occupation and men's mean probability of being in a male-dominated occupation, that difference is 0.6. That is the value of D. So that's, you could say that 60% of men in that birth cohort in 1940 would need to move to a female-dominated occupation in order for all occupations to have an even distribution of men and women in them. So this is on the right-hand side now. I've essentially calculated that difference for all of these birth cohorts. That's the solid line there. And you can think about this as the change, the cohort change in D after purging out any age differences and differences in the distribution across cohorts of ages that are in the data. So again, we see 1940, that 0.6, it's simply showing up. That's just the difference between these two mean probabilities is 0.6. And you can see a fairly steady decline across birth cohorts in D. I've also given you in this dotted line, that's what I'm calling the naive estimate. That's if you just are calculating for every birth cohort D separately. And that's exactly what I showed you, I think in the third slide in the talk. The point here is that the standard way that we think about calculating D, just looking at different cohorts and calculating the value of D for each cohort, that actually underestimates the amount of integration that there is through cohort succession. This linearized APC model, by purging out age, is actually showing you a slightly more extreme change across cohorts in D. And again, at the very bottom, we do know that more of the change in D is coming from women than from men, because that coefficient on the slope is about twice as high for women as for men. So this is now looking at age change, aging effects sort of over the life cycle, again, as these people within a cohort are moving through calendar time. What you can see here is that in general, these life cycle changes are really quite modest. My co-author Daphne and I were really quite surprised at how little change we see across the age groups once you purge out the effects of cohorts here, in terms of the amount of change in the probability of being in a male-dominated occupation. You do see a slight inverted U shape for men. So if you wanted to characterize this at all, you would say that there's an increase in the probability of being in a male-dominated occupation up until about age 30. It's very, very steady, but it sort of starts to tail off later on in the career. For women, we actually see a monotonic increase, the steepest increase occurring very early in the career, and then a little bit more toward the end of the career, but more or less a steady and monotonic increase. What I think is very interesting about this women's curve is that there's really no evidence here of what we might think about as a motherhood job penalty. It doesn't seem to be the case that there's a decline in the probability of being in a male-dominated occupation for women who are in their 30s and their early 40s, which you can think about as peak child rearing and childbearing years. So again, we can play this exercise, do this exercise of calculating D. Here I've given you the difference between these two probabilities for women and for men at age 30. It's again 0.6, and we can carry this across for all of the different age groups. And what you see is that once you adjust for cohort, you actually do see it's slight, but there's a fairly steady decline across the life cycle in the segregation of men and women across occupations. Again, the dotted line is that naive model. That's exactly what I showed you in that third slide, if you are to just calculate D for every age group separately. So again, life cycle change in D is showing a monotonic decline, that people are becoming more integrated occupationally as they age. And that unadjusted D, the old-fashioned way, if you want to look at it that way, this seems to be underestimating the amount of integrative change over the life course. So then the final piece of this descriptively that I wanted to show you before I get to the education and parental status results, which I'll go through more quickly, is this idea of comparative cohort careers. Again, these are cohort-specific age-time trajectories. If you want to know where these estimates are coming from, I'm essentially taking the diachronic cohort curve and the diachronic age curve, and I'm adding them together. I'm not sticking in the period nonlinearities just because I think it makes the graphs a lot more messy and not all that easy to read. It turns out there really aren't a lot of nonlinearities by period in the data. I can show you that in an appendix if you want, but you probably don't want. So here's a graph with the comparative cohort careers for women. And I'm just going to march you through how you read this graph. And then I'm going to turn to kind of the substance of what I think this graph is saying. So each of these lines in the graph is a cohort. It's observed at different ages. And you'll notice the earliest cohort here that I have is the 1907 cohort. The full data includes the 1902 cohort, but they're really only observed at age 68 or higher because my data don't start until 1971. So for each cohort, we have different length of segments. Some of the cohorts are observed across their entire working careers. So for example, this 1950 cohort, we see them from age 18 all the way up until age 72. It says 68 at the bottom, but it's actually 72. But most of the cohorts were only observing them for a small segment. So the lines are the point estimates. The gray is the confidence interval, the 95% confidence interval. You can see as cohort increases, so as you read from right to left, the probability of being in a male-dominated occupation for women is increasing, which is exactly what I showed you in those prior graphs, just in a slightly different way. As you read from right to left on the graph, age is increasing, and you also see an increase in the probability of being in a male-dominated occupation as age increases, right? So the vertical distance between these segments, these line segments, you think about the vertical distance here compared to the vertical distance here, really think about those as rings on a tree. And in good years, there's a lot of distance between the rings on the tree. In leaner years, where there's less change, the rings are much closer together. So that vertical distance is giving you the cohort to cohort change at a given age in the person's life cycle in that probability of being in a male-dominated occupation. So that's how to read the graph. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of the substance here, if you stare at this a lot, you can see that among women, there was really only one cohort that backslid relative to the immediately preceding cohort. So they had a lower probability of being in a male-dominated occupation than the cohort right before them. That was the cohort that was born in 1927. There are other cohorts where those confidence intervals overlap for some successive sets of cohorts. So for example, these cohorts, you see a lot of overlapping in the gray confidence intervals. Part of that is just a relative paucity of data, particularly for women in those older cohorts. There just weren't all that many women in the labor force in those cohorts. Right, so, but you do see relatively little backsliding, just that one cohort that did worse than its predecessor. And what I've done here is highlight some cohort sets that I think are particularly interesting. First of all, this cohort born between 1947 and 1966, the year preceding this 1967 cohort, those cohorts experienced especially rapid progress in terms of the probability of being in a male-dominated occupation. But we also see that the cohorts that were born between 1982 and 2001, they're also showing slightly more rapid progress toward integration than my generation here, these cohorts that were born between 1967 and 1981. Right, so we saw a lot of change for these 47 to 62 cohorts, but we're also seeing kind of an expansion of the lines, if you will, for these very young cohorts. What I take from this is that stagnation and segregation is really, to the extent that it exists at all, it's really limited to these 1960s to 1970s birth cohorts. The younger women who are in the labor market now, at least in their early careers, they actually seem to be doing quite a lot better, kind of accelerating that progress toward integration, again, after some quite lean years for these 62 to 82 cohorts. So this graph is now doing the same thing, but looking for men. First of all, I want you to notice the y-axis shift, right? So the numbers on the y-axis are much higher. So men have a much higher probability of being in a male-dominated occupation. So that's going on. I tried to keep the scale, the distance between the lowest and the highest number the same across the two graphs, but it's just a mean shift up here for men. But I also think what's important here is that compared to the women's graph, the lines are simply much more compressed, right? So you see more overlap in the confidence intervals. You do see also more backsliding across successive cohorts. So for example, the 1952 to 1962 cohorts just had a higher probability of being in male-dominated occupation than the earlier cohorts did. At the same time, here I'm highlighting the most recent cohorts, the 1967 to 1996 actually birth cohorts. They actually showed a substantial intercohort decline in the probability of being in a male-dominated occupation, right? So the men, these younger cohorts of men, are also contributing to the integration of occupations much more than their predecessors did. So just highlighting here at age 28, there's actually about a 6 percentage point decline in the probability of being a male-dominated occupation between the 1967 birth cohort and the 1992 birth cohort. So very, very quickly, that's just the overarching trends. Very, very quickly, I want to show what goes on if you divide up the data now by education level. And what I've done here is given you the diachronic cohort trend. Again, you can think about this as the integration through cohort succession. These are the college-educated men. Oops, sorry, clicked here. College-educated men are the dotted line. The non-college men are the solid line. And first of all, you can see a definite mean shift downward, right? So the college-educated men are much less likely to be in a male-dominated occupation than the non-college men. And that occurs throughout for all of these cohorts. But you also see virtually no change for these college-educated men in terms of the likelihood of different cohorts being in less male-dominated occupations. Right, so all of the change that we were seeing for men in the pooled data were really coming from these non-college educated men and them declining in their probability of being in a male-dominated occupation. If you look for women, you see a very, very different picture. Both the college-educated and the non-college educated women, are increasing their probability of being in a male-dominated occupation. We do see kind of this divergence for the late 1950s, early 1960s birth cohorts, and it's just the college-educated women that saw that big bump up. But in general, you see that integration is happening for both college and non-college women, but it's only happening for the non-college men. This is now doing the same type of graph, but looking at the age differences. Again, we see, the age trend, the college-educated men are showing virtually no change across the life course. That inverted U is all driven by the non-college educated men. And the college and the non-college educated women are really showing very, very parallel trends until you get to this very, very late career where presumably there's a lot of selectivity in who's still in the labor market after age 60 or so. This is now the last set of results that I think I'll show. This is looking now by parental status. So we have the parents here are the dotted lines for men in purple and for women in orange. The women who are in the solid lines, those are women who don't have a child in the household. The men who don't have a child here in the household, that's the solid purple line. A couple things to note here is that you do see within gender differences in levels. So the fathers are more likely to be in a male-dominated occupation than the childless men. Conversely, the mothers are less likely to be in a male-dominated occupation than the childless women. The upshot of that is that we see more gender segregation among parents than we do among childless adults, right? So if you're just, again, going to calculate the difference between the dotted lines at any cohort is going to be greater than the difference between the solid lines. So that's one feature of this analysis by parental status. The other is that you're really seeing parallel cohort change within a gender, right? So the childless women here, the solid orange line, and the mothers in the dotted orange line, very, very parallel trends across cohorts. And the same thing goes for the comparison of fathers to childless men. And then finally, looking at the age trends, we do see some differences in the trajectories across the ages. But you actually see that the parents for women, the mothers are slightly less of an increase early career in terms of their probability of being in a male-dominated occupation. The lines do tend to converge around age 50. One of the problems here, though, is that this is probably because the data that I have only indicate residential kids who are living in the household. And we would hope maybe that children would leave the household by the time the parents are in their 50s. I still have a child who's living at home, but in general, I think that's a little bit unusual, at least in the US. Okay, I'm going to skip the bounding analysis because of time, and I just want to go kind of to the substantive takeaways that I hope you get out of this. First of all, we do see really quite pronounced integration across cohorts. These younger cohorts of men and women do have a much more equal probability of being in a male-dominated occupation than the older cohorts do. Or put differently, we are seeing a pronounced decline in occupational segregation for these younger cohorts compared to older cohorts. We're also seeing fairly asymmetric integration across cohorts in this idea of cohort succession. By gender, there's a little bit of asymmetry in that women are changing their probabilities of being in a male-dominated occupation much more rapidly across cohorts than men are. But there's also kind of this interesting twist by education in that three of the groups, so non-college women, college women, and non-college men are showing this integration across cohorts, but there's really no cohort change for these college-educated men. And then finally, the standard calculations, the way that we've typically made these calculations about cohort change in D, to the extent that people calculate D by cohort at all, it tends to underestimate change because we're kind of polluting that a little bit with age-related shifts. The second substantive takeaway is that there's relatively modest life cycle change. It does seem to occur mainly among those younger workers and the very old workers. Again, there's a selection story going on here in terms of who's in the labor force. We know that people who get more education tend to enter the labor force at slightly older ages. We also know that people who don't retire by age 65 tend to be either people in professional occupations, like a professor. They last forever. In the United States, there's no mandatory retirement in the United States, or it tends to be lower income people who need to keep working in order to be able to survive because it's the United States and we don't have good retirement benefits here. So there's that modest life cycle change at the beginning and the end, but we're really not seeing evidence of a motherhood segregation penalty. There just isn't an increase in the integration that's going on for women in those peak child rearing years, or really even for the mothers that we observe in those child rearing years. And then finally, the third substantive takeaway, and the summary of I think the entire lesson here is that when we talk about a stalled revolution in occupational segregation, and I think probably in other forms of gender inequality in the labor market as well, we kind of risk overstating the extent to which that's stalled. We need to be pretty careful about the narrative that we're giving out here. Yes, we did see slower integration for those 1967 to 1982 cohorts than for the preceding cohorts, but that seems to be offset by really persistent cohort decline. Even though those cohorts were integrating more slowly, they were still integrating. There was no backsliding that was going on. And also we're seeing a slightly more optimistic story for those fairly young cohorts, both men and women, in terms of them converging in their probabilities of being in these male-dominated occupations. So this is my last slide here. My advisor and actually a dear friend of mine in South Lebanon in 2007 wrote this piece, The Four Gloomy Futures of Sex Segregation for Sex Segregation. I actually think we might need to update that and one more optimistic one, with the main caveat being that what do they say in the financial services, that past performance is no guarantee of future results? I think we're seeing that now. In the United States, this anti-DEI backlash that's going on does have the potential to retrench some of that sex segregation and maybe make the future a little bit less optimistic than it seemed even 2 years ago. So I will stop share here and take questions, and I thank you for your patience with the talk.
That was really amazing, really amazing. I, as the host, will take the lead in making the questions. It's a privilege that I can accept. Well, first of all, there is a slowdown of the gender integration for some generations born in the midst of the 20th century, those born during the 60s and 70s, as you showed. And why is that? I mean, probably what Paula England and other authors were looking at was that slowdown, right? Because the period trends were mostly affected by the cohorts that were most in the labor market at the time. But
Yep.
Now newer cohorts started entering. If I'm not mistaken, Paula wrote the first text on that at the beginning of the 2000s, and
Yep.
before she Hochschild, I forgot her name. Anyway, the idea of stalling the gender revolution was not new, actually, right?
Yeah.
So people were looking at those at these generations that were coming to the labor market and bringing with them this slow velocity of integration. Is there any new explanations, and why the new generations started speeding up again?
Yeah.
This is a new thing that I was not expecting. Also, is there any explanation for these different trends for male with higher education that actually was very, I don't know, distressing and strange for me? We do not expect people with higher education to be more unequal in this sense. And that at least for me, I was not expecting that. A final question, could selection bias change the results? I mean, modeling selection bias explicitly. You were not. I was thinking about some kind of Heckman model because not all women enter the labor market and become segregated.
Yeah.
I don't know how women participation in the labor market behaves in the United States, but in Brazil, it's very. I don't know. It's a huge inequality yet. So there is some kind of hidden segregation that maybe biased estimates for the coefficients. I don't know if that makes sense because
Yeah.
but the idea, the reasoning is kind of similar to that one related to wages, right? You do not observe wages for people who are not in the labor market, and also you do not observe occupation for people who are not in the labor market. People, when they have low payoffs, they kind of select out, and we do not see that happening. And I was thinking that maybe that can change a little bit some things. I don't know if that makes sense. I was just wondering here. That is very that was amazing. I was not aware of this new way of trying to isolate the age per reading cohort trends, and I will take a look at that. Thank you. I think, are you willing to answer my question right now? It's not just one question, but if you want to, we can gather other people to at least more two people for. Can we gather more questions?
Well, why don't I take yours? Partly because I won't remember otherwise, and then I'll forget yours. And they were great questions. So you asked the question. One of the questions, you have a few here, and I'm going to repeat them back to you, and actually repeat them in a way that I want to answer them, as opposed to what you actually asked me. This is like a trick for presenters, right? Don't answer the question that you were asked, but answer the question you want to answer. So you asked the question about why, and the answer is, I have no idea, right? I'm not testing any mechanisms here. And this is, this is kind of this is a big picture descriptive paper. And I think that, we have lots and lots of potential explanations, but nobody can really isolate them. I mean, how do you isolate the effect of gender essentialism versus a change in traditionalism? I mean, we really can't, we're not at a point where we can do that, particularly in anything that resembles a causal model with what are really repeated cross-sectional data. So I'm just going to punt on the why question. I mean, I do think that, what we think about as the stall in the stalled revolution, it is, your intuition is correct. It is a period. So those were the cohorts where change was still happening, integration was still happening, but it was a little bit slower. And in that chunk of time when people talk about the stall, say between 1995 and 2010, those cohorts were really dominating the labor market, right? So it's, in some sense, it's a little bit of a weighting issue. But I think that's, that's kind of part of the point that I want to make, is that we risk kind of reifying this idea of a stall when it's really a function of the composition of the labor force that's going on. Now, you also asked a question about why are the more recent cohorts doing better? I don't, again, I don't really know why. I can tell lots of stories about why. I do think, and this is the kind of the footnote to all of this, is that we know that the index of dissimilarity, it's also picking up changes in occupational distributions, right? And so you have this real economic restructuring that's going on at the same time, this decline in manufacturing work, which tends to be very male dominated, and the rise of service work and professional work, which tends to be either gender equal or female dominated. So part of what could be going on is that men are less likely to be in these male dominated occupations, partly because those occupations are just becoming a smaller share of the labor force, right? There are ways that I can address that piece of it. There are other indices that do all sorts of attempts to take out the gender margins. We wanted to start with something that's really simple and understandable, relatively speaking. But we also think that, when you're thinking about kind of big picture social change, change in what's going on in the labor market, that's a part of it. And if you think about people's lived experience of who they're exposed to at work, they're not kind of saying, well, netting out the changes in the occupational structure. They're really kind of living this experience that includes what's going on with the occupation margins. So you also asked about selection biases. And here I would say, yes, there's a lot of selection going on. There's selection into the labor force. There's selection into education. There's selection into survival. There's selection into marriage, if you're thinking, and parenthood, if you're thinking about parental status. But I would say I would push back against the idea that these estimates are biased because of that selection. And I think that, this idea of selection bias really comes from a place of of wanting to estimate and isolate a causal effect. Well, age, period, and cohort aren't causes of anything anyway, right? They're kind of an accounting mechanism, really. They're not, we don't think that cohort causes something. Your experiences that you had because you were a member of a given cohort might cause something, but the cohort itself is just an indicator. So I would say, yes, a lot of this story is selection. Who's still in the labor market after age 68, who's not in the labor market at age 18. But I would say that when we're thinking about big picture social change, that's not really a bias. That's kind of a piece, a part of the whole. And that's actually that's the last question that I wrote down. But I think other people probably have similar types of questions. I guess I should also say that I have been absolutely stunned by how complicated it is to think about these models and the estimands and the parameters when you have occupation, gender, and age and time. So 4 variables, you're trying to estimate essentially combinations of these 4 variables. It's really complicated. And then you think about, okay, now I'm going to add a Heckman parameter into that. It blows my mind to even think about what I'm doing anymore. So I'm just gonna kind of slice off what I can chew, recognizing that then you have education and you have parental status and you have somebody told me, well, you should run this separately for big classes, major occupation groups. I'm like, okay, now we're starting to get complicated. So I take the point about some sort of a probability of being in the labor market as being a covariate. I certainly could put that into the model. I mean, you could stick anything in a regression model, right? But just thinking about what that would actually mean, it gets to be very, very confusing to me very, very quickly. Yeah, great questions. Thank you so much.
Great answers. Well, I will call Carlos Antonio.
Okay. Thanks very, very much, Kim, for the presentation, and I don't have a question. I would like to encourage our students to see that and to be inspired or by your work, because I think I think that we have data in Brazil that's very similar to the CPS. We have since the 70s, we have like a national household survey that's collected almost every year except for census years. And the design of the survey is very similar to the CPS. So I think, and I think we have some studies showing that there is a lot of change in Brazil. For example, if you think about the percentage of women graduating from higher education, in the 1960s, from the census of 1960, it is less than 10%. And then in 91, it changed. There are more women, graduating than men, and this has been increasing a lot. So, and there's a lot of change there, and also in terms of occupation. So, and one thing that I think it's different in your paper that I liked very much is the idea that you are doing this analysis by cohort. It makes a lot of sense, because if you think about the educational changes, they happen more between cohorts, and they are related to occupation in very much. So it's very interesting that you took this path, and you got this old idea by Ryder and getting this career, I forgot the name, it's the age and cohort together, and that's very, very interesting. So I would like to encourage our students to follow this path, because I think there are very interesting questions to be asked about Brazil, which is also a very large country with, that passed through many changes across this time, even more change than the United States, because it was a rural country and now it's a urban country. So I think I just would like to encourage our students to be inspired by you, and thank you for the presentation. And I mean, it wasn't a question; it was
Yes,
since we
well,
have lots of students here.
yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm blushing, although you can't tell because the lighting in my office is absolutely terrible. But yes, thank you. And
Okay.
and I am actually very serious. I gave this talk at the ECSR, the European Consortium for Sociological Research, and also I gave it in Nuremberg. So I'm kind of going around the world, and I really do want people to take this and think about it in the context of their own countries. I also, I mean, this is a little bit of editorializing, but I think sociology is a little bit late to the game, but certainly a massive move toward causal inference, right? Everybody wants to do causal models and DAG models and, specify this little effect and make sure we're doing it correctly, which is fantastic. But I also kind of think that sociology's comparative advantage is in these kind of big picture processes, some of which really are, it's okay to do descriptive work. I think that we need a descriptive revolution as much as we need a causal revolution. So that's my little soapbox. But the point is that, yeah, it would be great if students took this up and did it for Brazil
exactly.
or, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just let me add something. It's this about causal inference. I'm also, I'm interested on that. I think it's interesting. But at the end of the day, you are estimating very small effects because you have in all of the models you have to go for,
Yeah.
like local average treatment effects or things that are very, are important for a very small population in fact. So we need these big descriptions. I totally agree with you. So
great, thanks, appreciate
great.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was already very impressed with the presentation, and I also loved the slogan about descriptive work. I totally agree. And yeah, for many reasons. Thank you for the talk. I have a small comment. I've been reading your work since my master's thesis, so it's very nice to
now
see
you know what
you
cohort
talk.
I'm in.
Yeah, and both of us, right? But all the stuff about microclasses and etc., I've moved on from that. But it was a really great inspiration, and your work is still a great inspiration, as we saw today in the talk. I have a simple question. You alluded to it in the discussion part of the presentation and here in the beginning of the discussion. But I think that when you present these results, or the early life cycle pops up, right? Besides cohort change, another big result is the huge slope of age in the beginning of the life cycle that also drives change, right? And you alluded to selection and etc. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about what are the drivers of those changes, and also like one thing, like we have like we organize these events mainly, like of course we have some selfish purpose to learn a lot and for ourselves, that the older scholars, but we have a huge group here of young masters and PhD students. And one thing that I really liked about the presentation is how you were able to, like, because the segregation indexes, one of their major problems are how you interpret them and what is the group that is driving change, right? Because they don't communicate that. And this strategy that you use, that you are able to parse out what's male related and what's female related, and bring it back to the index it's really great. I'm working with it in the context of racial segregation in schools, and I'll certainly, I wrote out many stuff here, and it was really inspiring to see strategies to make the methods more
Yeah. So thank you. I'll tell a little bit of a story about that, which I hope is inspiring to the PhD students. So this paper I wrote with Haowen Zhang, she was the first author. It was actually her second year paper, or she started it actually in a class that she took in her first year, and she spent the better part of 2 months trying to convince me that this approach to estimating segregation indices was correct. And she persisted in convincing me that it was actually correct. And I was very, very skeptical. And now I love it, and I use it in a lot of different projects. So in case you thought that you could never influence what your professors are doing, this is a classic example of how she was able to really change the course of a lot of my work. So the other comment that you had, Flavio, was about the early career selection stuff. And I think what's going on there is that we really do have it's the people who are going to college and to masters and various professional doctorates. The number of PhDs in the data is pretty trivial. Sorry, but it's those folks are entering the labor market later, and the men who are entering later are more likely to be in the professions, which tend to be fairly gender integrated occupations, right? So there's not really a huge difference among doctors, for example, now in gender ratios. And then the women who are entering later, the women who are entering early on in the life course, they're entering a lot of the service work. The hairdressers, the retail sales type occupations, very female dominated. The women who are going to college are then entering those professions, right? So I think that's why you see that bump up. It's really in basically who's in the labor force at these various times. So that's my story. I can look at that a little bit. But there's always going to be limits because, again, of course, you never observe the occupations of people who aren't in labor force, going back to Rogério's comment very early on. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have Hobson also.
First of all, thank you very much. And my question, it's about, because you have said that your data come from just United States, and you have interest to collect data from different countries. And I remember that I read something around 5 years ago, an interesting article called, let me check. The article is in Portuguese, but make a translation will be gender, class, and race, intersectionality and consubstantiality in social relationship from Helena Hirata. And there's the point, because let me quote a specific point. She says that in the case of Japan, women are the functional equivalent for immigrants and are subject to the same treatment imposed for foreign immigrants in other countries. So my point is not the same issues, not the same subject of research than yours, is not exactly the same, but I think there's a common place, because when you need to choose another country that for collected data, I think maybe Japan can be a very interesting one, because this article proposed that maybe in Japan they was more instead of accept immigrants for some kind of jobs, they prefer to put women for that kind of jobs. That is the result of his research. She collected from Brazil, France, and Japan, because she's a Brazilian Japanese woman that nowadays are teaching in Paris 8 University. And that can take my attention. And I want to know what do you think about? Maybe do you think about the Japanese case can be a little different because I don't know, maybe some a version of immigrant or something like that. Maybe there's a version of immigrant, maybe they put women to work instead of immigrants.
Yeah, yeah. Um, you know, I think that the Japanese case is fascinating, and partly because at least the classic way of thinking about the Japanese labor market is much more organized around organizations and kind of lifetime employment for some. But if you're not in these kind of major organizations, then you are very much marginalized in the labor market. And I think that's part of the story of gender here. So it could be in the Japanese case. It may not even be occupational segregation that's really the main inequality driver. It might be organizational segregation, which is much harder to collect data on in the US. But I think in your general points, I mean, I'm never really a huge fan of what I would call flyover comparative work, where you have, you know, you stick 50 or 14 different countries in a analysis and you fit like a hierarchical linear model and you have country level effects. And I mean, I think the problem with that, and I've done a little bit of it myself, by the way, I think the problem with that is that that the number of variables that could differ across countries always exceeds the number of countries that you have, you know, so you kind of get a little bit of a not a very rich picture of what's going on at the country level. So I'm much more of a fan of this type of work of, you know, let's identify 3 countries and do kind of a deep dive into each of those 3 countries, whether it's Brazil, France, and Japan, or some other set of countries. And I do think, you know, in my more ambitious moments, I kind of think, well, David and Maria Charles, actually back when I was in graduate school, did kind of a big project where there were specialists who were writing on each country. I was doing the US, and then there were people doing Korea and Japan and so forth. Let's do that again, but do this method as opposed to what we were pushing back then at the time. So yeah, I mean, I think it's all just to agree with you that I think that you are going to get different ways that these patterns are going to play out in different countries or even regions of countries. I have managed to get some people in Germany interested in this. And for people who study Germany and trends over time, of course, the big question is East versus West Germany, right? So yes, it's one country now, but it hasn't always been one country. And in some sense, they act like 2 different countries in terms of the labor market. So, you know, every country is going to have something that's a little bit like that in terms of an interesting twist on this story that I'm telling for the United States. Yeah. So thank you for the comment. I'd love to work with lots of people who are area experts in a way that I'll never be an area expert on Japan, France, or Brazil.
I will invite more of the audience to make questions as well. If they do not raise their hands, I will make another one. That's a threat.
I have a question actually.
Okay.
I'm terribly sorry. I do not have a camera.
Okay.
You were talking about the recent push against DI hires, against women in the workplace. I like to inquire you about what do you think is the causality of that, the origin of that, the nature of this anti-woke movement in the workplace?
Yeah. What do I think is the cause of that, and what do I want to be on YouTube as saying is the cause of that, right? I mean, I think that it's all part of a broader backlash against what we might think about as Enlightenment values, right? So it's very much a movement that is embedded in a particular view of Christianity. It's not even, I wouldn't even call it a Christian umbrella movement. It's a very, very particular form of Christianity that tends to be very patriarchal. It tends to be kind of very traditional. And we see this, you know, not just in these anti-DEI movements within the labor force, labor market, but we're also seeing it in, you know, all of a sudden there are people who are talking about raising the fertility rate of American women, but doing it by essentially eliminating or reducing access to not only abortion, but also birth control, and to kind of devising these policies that are very much encouraging women to remain in the home and have babies. You know, this is this is kind of a very, very cyclical, I think, and traditional view what a society should look like. And we're seeing that kind of in ascendancy in the United States right at the moment. That said, there's a lot of pushback against it too. And you might say that it's really, really hard to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak, of having, it's hard for me to imagine women who have out-earned men in the United States in BA degrees since 1982, and currently out-earn men in virtually all education levels. It's really hard for me to imagine that shifting and those women now saying, okay, well, I'm going to give up the $400,000 that I spent on a Cornell education and go back into unpaid labor. So, it's not entirely clear how much this DEI backlash is really going to affect kind of these big picture trends that I'm looking at. But I think it's always useful to step back whenever you're talking about a trend or a cohort succession to recognize that there's no guarantee that that's linear, right? You could go back to a situation where even though these very young cohorts in the labor market now seem to be a little bit more integrated, that could change, for cohorts for 5 or 10 years, depending on how this anti-DEI and more generally this kind of return to traditionalism plays out in the United States.
Thank
I
you.
have one question more. If anyone want to ask another question, I can pass my turn. No? Well, let's go. I was wondering, Kim, if you have done other kinds of exercise, exploratory exercise, such as you have done in your previous paper with Stanley. For instance, the composition of trends between compositional changes and changes in returns using Oaxaca or other similar methods.
Yeah.
Because that could maybe shed a light on not just the mechanisms, but some major reasons. For instance, this educational change or the composition of the labor market or sectoral changes or changes related to, I don't know, demographic, I don't know. Because I see that the data description of the trends is the first step and a very important thing to do. But I was still wondering about the why. I know it was not the point of your presentation and work, but once you have done a exercise that helped us think about that in other about how the segregation in fields lead to segregation in occupations, I was wondering if some kind of exercise of the same type has been executed.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to be able to do basically the paper that Hao-En and I did, but looking over time. And unfortunately, the US data just aren't there. We just don't have, we have field of study and occupation since, I think 2018, maybe the first year. So we don't, or maybe it's 2008. But it's not a very long time chunk where we actually have those data. So doing that type of decomposition isn't possible. One of the things that I do want to do, and I alluded to it, I danced around a little bit, is think about trying to figure out how much of the change that we're seeing is driven by occupational restructuring, and how much of it is actually something that's going on in the net association between gender and occupation, if you want to think about it that way. So I think that's going to be my next step here. I thought, and we're working a little bit on kind of some simulations to say, well, what would happen if all the cohorts in that particular period are the same size, to try and get at, well, is it a weighting issue that those cohorts were dominant in that stalled period? I mean, the challenge, of course, is that all these variables are interrelated, right? So you get into the same APC problem when you're trying to do a simulation, because you can't just change one thing without changing at least one of the other things too. So it's, I mean, this is, driving us absolutely bonkers. Our intuition, I think, is right, but how you actually demonstrate that is another question. I do know how to address the occupational restructuring piece of it, because then I think it's just a matter of choosing a different index and saying, well, if you use a index that purges out the occupation margins, look what happens. Not entirely satisfactory from a why question or from a why point of view, but a little bit making progress at least toward that. Yeah.
Yeah. One more question, taking the privilege of post again. Well, what about, I see that it's making simulations is highly dependent on the functional form that you specify for your covariates. And but it's not quite the same problem as the APC, right? Because it's a perfectly linear dependence in the case of the APC, because age is equal to period minus cohort and so on.
Yeah.
It's not, and I was wondering, how did Chris Winship and his co-author propose a solution for this problem? I know they are working with that for a long time. Winship has published other kinds of solutions, and they are quite aware of all the critics since the first works. But I would like you to share a little bit about the method. You said that they use orthogonal polynomials. You can ask as technical as you want to. I was wondering how can we believe, because the work is highly dependent on the idea that we are actually describing the trends. We are not talking about causality, it's not the point, but something was identified. Even if it was the deviations from linearities, something is being identified. And what is being identified, and what are the main assumptions to identify it? Because this problem has pursued sociologists for a long time, since at least the end of the 70s. And again and again, some new critics come up and then say, no, you are not identifying things. And if you change a little bit the range of the age groups and cohort groups and period groups, sometimes the trends, they change a little bit. The slope of the trends can change. I have done some exercise by myself using APC models, and sometimes using 5-year groups lead to a result, then using 3-year groups lead to another result, and the trends can be more or less sensitive to this.
Yeah.
So what is the solution they propose?
Yeah. So a few things. I mean, we're also kind of at that stage of trying out different, bounds on the cohorts and so forth. I mean, I think that it's not really a trick, but this linearized APC model, essentially you're allowing period to be in the age effect. So you're allowing this life cycle change is of people aging through time, and you're allowing the cohorts to kind of move, being pushed through time as well. So period is kind of in both the age and the cohort. And that's very explicit in their papers, that when you're thinking descriptively, it's much better to do that than it is to impose very strong assumptions on one or more effects to be able to identify the other ones. That said, some of their other work that's really is trying to do more of a causal reckoning is basically taking those parameters of the LHPC model and doing a bounding analysis. So essentially you can identify, they call it the canonical solution line, but it's basically the solution of all possible combinations of age, period, and cohort effects. And you can basically say, and that was the slides that I flipped through in like 3 seconds because I ran out of time. But that will lead you a little bit closer to being able to estimate actual separate A, P, and C effects. There, I mean, I think the punchline that I found is that if you assume that period change has been generally integrative, and cohort change has been generally integrative or completely stalled, as long as it's not kind of resegregated, so either null or integrative, there's absolutely no way that you can have a motherhood segregation penalty for women, because the data are just not consistent with that type of a parameter given these assumptions about the other two parameters. That's as far as I've taken it. I know that Ethan and Winship are working on kind of trying to push a little bit further on the causal mechanisms here. I think that the further they go on that direction, the more controversial their work is becoming. So I'm actually really good friends with Steve Morgan, who is another Winship Fosse, that Harvard shop. And he's basically like, yeah, Chris and Ethan are just going off the deep end on this mechanistic causal inference stuff. So it's like, okay, I don't want to get in the middle of that one. But it is a really good question. I think that one of the things that I like about this approach is that you may not agree with the assumptions, but at least they're kind of clear what those assumptions are. And a big one is that I'm assuming an additive effect of age and cohort as they're moving through time. And you might think, well, why do we think it's additive? Why don't we think it's multiplicative? And I'm doing it because that's kind of the convention in this accounting model, is these additive effects. But at least it's fairly clear, and somebody else can come along and say, well, wait a second, why are we really assuming that it's additive as opposed to some other functional form? So that would be what I'd say. I have no desire to wade into this methodological literature, really. I like the tools, but I'm more interested in the substance than I am in stepping on that Lego minefield as I
That's a great image.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
Leonardo, I just want to say hi. Yes. Yes.
Hey, Kim. Nice to see you. Nice
Yeah,
to see
nice
you.
A familiar face.
Yeah.
That's great.
Finally in Brazil.
Good. Good.
I think that's it. We have reached the end of the seminar. I would like to thank you very much, Professor Weeden. It was a really honor to have you here with us. And I hope we keep discussing your work and maybe our work too with you in the next time.
Perfect.
I would like also to thank for all the people who have come to the seminar, the audience in the YouTube and also in the Zoom room. And next, I will now switch to Portuguese to make some announcements, right? Nosso próximo seminário é com o professor André Salata, ele vai ser em junho, daqui mais ou menos 30 dias, e nós vamos avisar vocês todos por lá, tá? Pelos nossos canais mesmo. Professor Weeden, I don't know if you want to say some final words and
Just thank you for the attention. I know it's really late there. It's 6:40.
No, 6:40,
Yeah.
That's okay. We would still be working yet. Okay. So thank you very much for everyone, and see you in the next seminar of NIED-CERES. Mariani, we can
Thank
end
you.
our presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.